January 5th, 1066. We are in Westminster Palace, and I want you to really put yourself in this room. It smells of incense, stale sweat, and just this absolute paralyzing terror of impending disaster.
Yeah, you can almost feel the tension in the air.
Right, because King Edward the Confessor is taking his final ragged breaths. And the men who are standing around his bed, they aren't just mourning a dying man. They are staring directly into a geopolitical abyss.
A massive one.
Because Edward has committed the single most catastrophic error a medieval monarch can possibly make. He is dying without a son.
Which is just, it's the ultimate medieval nightmare.
Exactly. He is leaving the richest, most heavily taxed, and highly organized kingdom in all of Northern Europe completely up for grabs.
It really is hard to overstate the sheer panic in that room. An empty throne in the 11th century is essentially a dinner bell for every warlord with a fleet and a grievance.
And a lot of them had both.
Right. And England wasn't just any prize either. Because of the incredible administrative systems we saw built up during the reigns of Ethelred and Canute, which we covered recently, England actually had a functioning mechanism for collecting silver.
The Danegeld and the regular geld taxes.
Exactly. It made England a staggering wealth generator. So whoever takes that throne essentially controls the Bank of Northern Europe.
And that sets the stage for today. Welcome to the culminating deep dive of Season 3. We are finally stepping into 1066.
The big one.
The massive one. And we're not looking at this just as some date you have to memorize for a history test. We are looking at it as the grand convergence of every single thread we've pulled in this entire series.
It really is the climax.
It is. It's an impossibly dramatic saga. You've got 3 kings, 1 empty crown, and 2 massive apocalyptic battles fought just 19 days apart at opposite ends of the country.
19 days. It's just insane to even think about the logistics of that.
Right. So our mission for you, the listener, today is to explore exactly how the events of this single, incredibly bloody year brought the Anglo-Saxon era to a violent halt, and how it served as the absolute definitive climax of the Viking Age.
And the stakes here are quite literally the modern world. The language you and I are speaking right now, the legal structures we live under, the very map of Europe, all of it was forged in the fires of these 12 months.
It's the hinge point of history.
It really is. It's the definitive moment where the age of the dragon ships, which began with such sudden terror at Lindisfarne, where that age finally closes.
And if you've been watching those Netflix shows like Vikings or Vikings, Valhalla, you already have this really visceral sense of the world we're talking about.
Oh yeah, those shows capture the vibe perfectly.
They really do. They dramatize those incredibly messy, vicious North Sea rivalries, the Norse and Norman connections, the raw ambition of these warlords. And when you watch those characters maneuvering, you are basically watching the exact generation that built the powder keg.
And 1066 is the year someone finally throws a torch into it.
Yes, perfectly said. So let's look at the 3 men holding torches. The first is the man who was physically in the room when Edward died. Harald Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex.
The ultimate political insider.
He really is. Now, we spent time with the Godwin family back in episode 15, seeing how King Canute elevated them to this spectacular height of power. Harald is an Englishman. He has the backing of the Witan at the King's Council. He controls massive armies. And his claim is that Edward the Confessor woke up on his deathbed, reached out, touched his hand, and explicitly named him successor.
Which, convenient or not, that carried massive legal weight.
Did anyone actually believe that happened, though, or was it just a convenient story?
Well, it almost doesn't matter if they believed it, because he had the machinery of the state behind him. The Witan knew a crisis was coming. They were terrified. And they didn't want a child or some weak foreigner on the throne.
They needed a general.
Exactly. Yeah. They needed a battle-tested commander right now. So Harald Godwinson isn't just named king. He is crowned instantly. Within hours of Edward's burial, Harald has the crown literally on his head.
It's a total masterclass in political speed. But that speed is necessary because Harald knows there's a man sitting just across the English Channel staring at the chalk cliffs of Dover with absolute incandescent rage.
Duke William of Normandy.
Yes. And this is where the threads of our series really start pulling tight. Because William is the direct descendant of Rollo, the Viking warlord who took Normandy back in episode 11.
And William has totally transformed that Viking inheritance. His people still have that Norse martial aggression, right? That raw, violent energy. But they've married it to Frankish military technology.
So they're not fighting like traditional Vikings anymore.
No, not at all. They are fervent, state-building Christians now. And they have perfected a completely new way of waging war. Heavy armored cavalry.
The medieval tank, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But William doesn't just have this terrifying modern army. He has a deeply personal grievance against Harold.
Right, so William's claim is twofold. He argues that years earlier, Edward the Confessor had explicitly promised him the English throne. Because Edward had spent a lot of time in exile in Normandy, right?
Right after the St. Brice's Day massacre, which we talked about in episode 20, Edward fled to Normandy, so there were deep ties there.
Right. But the real leverage, the brilliant piece of political propaganda that William uses, comes from a shipwreck. A few years before 1066, Harald Godwinson washed up on the coast of France, and he ended up as a quote-unquote guest at William's court.
A very heavily armed guest situation. Hostage is probably a better word.
Yeah, he wasn't really free to leave. And while he was there, William basically forced Harold to swear an oath to support his claim to the English throne.
And the mechanics of that oath are so vital to understand for this whole conflict, because the Norman chroniclers claim that William essentially tricked Harold.
Oh, right, the table story.
Yes, he had Harold swear on this table, but hidden underneath the cloth out of sight were the holiest religious relics William could possibly find, the literal bones of saints.
So to a modern person, that sounds like a neat parlor trick, but back then this was serious.
Oh, it was cosmic.
Yeah.
In the medieval mindset, swearing on relics and breaking that oath isn't just a political betrayal. It actually endangers your immortal soul. You become a perjurer against God himself.
So when Harold takes the crown in London, William immediately spins this. He doesn't just say, hey, Harold stole my land. He goes to the Pope. And he says, Harold is an oath breaker. He has defiled the saints.
And it works. The Pope actually gives William a papal banner.
Which is a massive PR victory.
It changes everything. William turns a massive opportunistic land grab into a holy crusade. He starts drawing landless knights and mercenaries from all over Europe. He's promising them English land and English silver if they just come fight for God and Duke William.
So you have Harald Godwinson sitting in London. He's watching this terrifying military startup forming across the channel. But William isn't his only problem, because the grand convergence of history is coming from the north as well.
The Thunderbolt of the North.
Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. Now, you already know his incredible life story from episode 14. We did a massive deep dive on him. The years in the elite Varangian Guard in Constantinople, the blinding of the Byzantine emperor, just the sheer towering physical presence of the man.
He really is the last great Viking.
He is. And he decides, looking at this chaos, that he wants England too.
Now, Hardrada's legal claim is incredibly flimsy. It's based on some old treaty from the days of Cnut's empire.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, he doesn't really need a strong legal claim.
Because he has a massive fleet.
Right. He has hundreds of dragon ships and an army of battle-hardened Norsemen. And crucially, he has a man who can give him the keys to the north of England.
Tostig Godwinson, King Harold's own brother.
Yeah, it is entirely Shakespearean.
It really is. Harold had exiled his brother Tostig a year earlier just to keep the peace in Northumbria. Because Tostig was a terrible ruler, and the Northerners hated him, so Tostig is burning with this toxic, consuming need for revenge, and he goes to Norway.
And he whispers in Hardrada's ear. He says, England is divided. My brother is illegitimate. If you sail, my loyalists will rise up and join you.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario for Harald Godwinson. He is a king trapped in a geographical vice. The Normans are chopping down forests and building ships in the south. The Vikings are gathering ships in the north. The question isn't if he will be invaded, it's who will land first. And can he crush one before the other arrives?
And this brings us to the logistics of medieval warfare, which is where this story gets so incredibly tense. Harold knows William is the immediate existential threat.
Right. You can't exactly hide thousands of men building an invasion fleet in Normandy.
No word gets across the channel quickly. So Harold gathers his army and marches down to the southern coast to wait.
And we really need to look at how the English army was actually structured at this point.
Oh, what?
Because Harold has his housecarls, these elite, highly trained, professional infantry who fight with those devastating two-handed Dane axes.
The special forces of the era?
Exactly. But they are a small core. The vast majority of his army is the fyrd, the peasant militia.
Which means Harold is fighting a war against time and biology. Because the men of the fyrd are farmers. They have brought whatever provisions they could carry in their packs, but you have tens of thousands of men just sitting on a beach.
They are eating through the local supplies at a terrifying rate.
And worse than that, they are watching the calendar. It's summer. Back home, their crops are ripening. If they don't go home to harvest, there is literally no food for the winter. Their children will starve.
It creates this agonizing waiting game. Through June, July, and August, Harold is using every ounce of his authority to hold this massive army together, just staring at the southern horizon, waiting for Norman sails.
But they don't come.
They don't, because of the most crucial localized variable in this entire history, the wind.
We have to talk about how insane William's logistical challenge actually was. He isn't just sailing men across the channel. He is sailing horses.
Which sounds simple until you actually think about it.
Exactly. Thousands of highly trained, extremely temperamental 1,500-pound war horses.
Yeah.
I mean, have you ever tried to coax a modern horse into a comfortable padded horse trailer?
It's a nightmare on dry land.
Now, imagine forcing 3,000 terrified war horses onto open, shallow draft wooden longships. You need massive specialized ramps, which, by the way, the Bayeux Tapestry actually shows us in detail.
Oh, it does.
Yeah, he shows the men leading the horses onto the ships, and you need perfect weather. You cannot transport a fleet like that in a storm, or the horses will panic, they'll break their legs, they'll kick through the hull, and they'll capsize the ships.
So William needed a strong, steady wind blowing from the south to push his heavy fleet across the channel safely. But for months, the wind stubbornly blew from the north. It physically pinned his armada against the French coast. He was just completely trapped.
So as August turns into September, the tension simply breaks on the English side. The supplies are completely gone. The men are on the verge of mutiny.
Right. Harold makes this devastating but totally unavoidable calculation. He has to feed his country. So on September 8th, he officially disbands the Fyrd. He sends the peasant militia home to harvest the crops. And he rides back to London with his housecarls.
The southern coast is left totally undefended.
Which is terrifying, but Harold likely assumed the sailing season was over, right? The autumn storms were approaching. He probably thought he had survived the year.
He definitely did. But the moment he drops his guard in the south, the universe just flips the board on him. Because while a north wind traps a fleet in France...
It acts as a superhighway for a fleet coming from Norway.
Exactly. That exact same wind that kept William pinned catches the massive square sails of Harald Hardrada's fleet. 300 ships, perhaps 10,000 men.
The last great Viking alongside the traitorous brother Tostig. They ride that north wind straight across the sea and sail up the River Ouse into Yorkshire.
And their arrival is just a massive shock to the system. The local English commanders in the north, the Earls Edwin and Morcar, they desperately scrape together whatever army they can to try and halt the Vikings before they can take the vital city of York.
And they clash at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th. Let's look at the mechanics of Fulford because Hardrada uses his Varangian Guard experience so brilliantly here.
He really shows why he's a legendary commander.
Right. So the battlefield is flanked by this swampy marsh. The English try to push the Vikings back, but Hardrada uses the soft, sucking terrain to his advantage. He anchors his line on the dry ground and just lets the English tire themselves out slogging through the mud.
And then he springs the trap.
Exactly. He wheels his veterans around their flank. He essentially closes a trap door on them. The northern English army isn't just defeated, it is physically shattered. Men are literally drowning in the mud trying to escape the Viking axes.
It's a total bloodbath. And York is terrified. They immediately surrender. Hardrada demands 150 hostages to ensure their loyalty, and he agrees to collect them a few days later.
He stands victorious. He believes the north is entirely his. Because in Hardrada's mind, King Harald Godwinson is 200 miles away in London, having just disbanded his army. There is simply no physical way a medieval army can respond fast enough.
But this is where Harald Godwinson proves he's one of the most capable and blindingly aggressive military commanders of his age. When word reaches London that the north has fallen, Harald does the impossible.
He doesn't spend weeks calling up a new massive army.
No, there's no time. He grabs his housecarls, he drafts whoever he can find along the road, and he forces them into a march that honestly defies human physiology.
Let's really break down the physics of this forced march, because it is mind-blowing. We're talking about covering 200 miles in 4 to 5 days.
On foot.
On foot. Wearing heavy chainmail hauberks that weigh 30 to 40 pounds. Carrying weapons, carrying shields. They are moving up the old Roman roads, chewing through 40 to 50 miles a day.
The caloric burn alone is staggering.
Men are bleeding through their leather boots. The weak are simply collapsing by the roadside and being left behind. It is a march fueled purely by adrenaline and the absolute desperate necessity of defending the realm.
But that brutal physical sacrifice buys Harald the most precious asset in warfare. Total, absolute surprise.
Right, because Harald Hardrada has no scouts out watching the southern roads. because he cannot fathom that an army could possibly be there.
Which brings us to the morning of September 25th. Stamford Bridge, just outside of York. It is an unseasonably hot, beautiful autumn day.
The Vikings are just lounging in the meadows by the River Derwent waiting to collect their hostages. And because it's so hot and because they feel completely safe, Hardrada has allowed his men to leave their heavy iron chainmail back at the ships.
Which are miles away.
Miles away. So they are armed, but they are completely unarmored, and suddenly they look up toward the ridge and they see a cloud of dust.
And flashing beneath that dust is the sunlight catching on thousands of steel spear tips and iron helmets.
It's the entire English army, fully armored, completely furious, and bearing down on them like a freight train. It is a catastrophic intelligence failure for the Vikings.
The English vanguard crashes into the Vikings, who are on the west bank of the river, and they immediately start slaughtering them in their unarmored state. The survivors frantically retreat toward the narrow wooden bridge spanning the Derwent.
They're desperately trying to cross so Hardrada can organize a shield wall on the east bank. And this is the moment that produces one of the most legendary visceral images of the entire Viking Age.
The berserker on the bridge.
Yes. The English are surging toward the bridge to crush the Norsemen before they can form up. But standing in the center of that narrow wooden structure is a single massive Viking berserker.
And we should note, this isn't just some saga myth that got exaggerated later. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles specifically records this lone warrior.
Right. The English themselves wrote about him. So let's think about the biomechanics of defending a bottleneck like that. The bridge is narrow enough that the English can't surround him. They can only come at him one or two at a time.
And he is wielding a Dane axe.
Right. And a Dane axe is a weapon designed to be swung with two hands. You use the torque of your hips and your shoulders to generate enough kinetic energy to literally shatter shields and cleave straight through iron helmets.
He's a human threshing machine. The English are throwing spears at him, they're firing arrows, but the accounts say he cuts down 40 men.
40 fully armored housecarls.
He just refuses to die. And he is single-handedly buying Harald Hardrada the vital minutes he needs to form his men into a defensive line on the other side.
But eventually, the English realize they cannot beat him toe-to-toe, so they get creative. An English soldier finds a wooden swill tub, basically a half-barrel floating by the riverbank.
Right, he climbs into it, he floats downstream under the wooden planks of the bridge, and using a long spear, he thrusts upward through the gaps in the timber.
He drives the spear up into the unarmored groin of the giant Viking. The warrior collapses in agony, the bottleneck is finally broken, and the English army just pours across the bridge like water bursting a dam.
And what happens next on the east bank isn't really a battle, it's an execution.
Yeah, the Vikings fight with the insane bravery of doomed men. Hardrada himself is raging at the front of his shield wall. He's fighting without armor, just trying to hack his way out of the trap.
But the English have the numbers, they have the momentum, and crucially, they have the chainmail.
Then comes the moment that definitively ends an era. A stray English arrow strikes Harald Hardrada squarely in the windpipe.
The man who survived the Byzantine Empire. The man who fought in Sicily and Bulgaria. The absolute terror of the north.
He dies choking on his own blood in the English dirt. His treacherous ally, Harald's brother Tostig, is also cut down. The Viking line finally shatters, and the English relentlessly hunt the survivors all the way back to their ships.
We really have to emphasize the sheer scale of the slaughter here, because Hardrada arrived in England with a fleet of 300 ships. When King Harald Godwinson finally calls off his men, he allows Hardrada's surviving son, Olaf, to take the shattered remnants of the army back to Norway.
Do you know how many ships they needed to carry the survivors?
24.
24 ships out of 300. It is a total annihilation. Scandinavia's military capacity to threaten England is permanently broken on that field.
If you pause history right here, on the evening of September 25th, Harald Godwinson is a legend. He has executed one of the greatest military maneuvers in European history. He has saved his kingdom, crushed his brother's rebellion, and destroyed the greatest warlord of the age.
He stands triumphant.
He does, for exactly 3 days.
Because on September 28th, while Harald is in York burying thousands of dead men, nursing his wounded, and letting his utterly exhausted men finally get some sleep, the wind in the English Channel shifts.
The exact breeze William of Normandy has been praying for all summer finally arrives. The wind blows out of the south. William instantly loads his horses, his knights, and his mercenaries into the ships, and he crosses the channel.
He lands at Pevensey on the southern coast, and the beaches are entirely empty. There is no Fyrd to resist him. There is no English fleet to intercept him.
William unloads his massive war horses. He actually constructs a prefabricated wooden fortress that he brought over in pieces.
Wait, he brought a castle in pieces on the boats.
Yeah, flat-pack castle, essentially. They just assembled it on the beach. And then he unleashes his men to systematically burn, loot, and terrorize the English countryside.
The timing is so profoundly cruel that it feels engineered by a novelist. It is a 19-day window. Harald had desperately hoped to face these invasions separately, and he did, but they fell in the absolute worst possible sequence.
Close enough that he had zero time to recover from the first, but far enough apart that he had to march the entire length of the country twice.
Picture the messenger arriving in York. Harald has just pulled off a miracle. His men's axes are literally chipped and dull from killing. Their armor is broken. Their feet are destroyed from the march. And the messenger tells him the Normans have landed in Wessex. They are burning your personal earldom to the ground.
Harald is faced with a monumental strategic choice here. And this is where we really have to contrast Harald with the great leaders we've discussed in previous deep dives.
Right. Think back to Alfred the Great in episode 16. Alfred was a master of survival. If Alfred were in Harold's position, he would have stayed in the north.
Absolutely. He would have let William sit on the coast and exhaust his own supplies. He would have traded space for time, letting William grow desperate while he slowly gathered the fresh militias of the western shires.
Or King Cnut from episode 15, the cautious empire builder. Cnut would have utilized diplomacy or maybe tried to trap William geographically.
But Harald Godwinson is an aggressively kinetic commander. The bold, impossibly fast instinct that told him to rush north and surprise Hardrada. That instinct had just won him the greatest victory of his life.
His blood is up.
Exactly. He believes he can do it again.
And William knows this. William is intentionally burning Wessex, which are Harold's personal lands, because he is baiting him. In the medieval social contract, a king must protect his people.
Yeah.
If Harold sits in London while his own tenants are slaughtered, he looks weak. His lords might start questioning his authority.
So Harald takes the bait. He turns his battered, bleeding army around, and he force marches them back south, another 250 miles.
It's agonizing to even think about. They stop in London just long enough to grab whatever fresh troops they can find, and they push straight toward the coast, hoping to catch William off guard, just as they had caught the Vikings.
But William of Normandy is not Harald Hardrada. William is deeply paranoid and highly organized. His cavalry scouts are patrolling miles inland. He knows Harald is coming long before the English army actually arrives.
So the element of surprise is completely gone, which brings us to October 14th, 1066. The two armies meet on Senlac Hill near the modern town of Battle, just north of Hastings.
And what we are looking at here is not just two armies clashing, it is the physical collision of two entirely different eras of warfare.
It really is a time machine battle. At the top of the hill, you have the Anglo-Saxon era. King Harold and his men fight exactly as they have for centuries. It's purely an infantry force. They form the shield wall.
Let's explain the physics of this, because it's not just guys standing near each other holding shields.
Right. You stand shoulder to shoulder, your shield overlapping the man to your right. The men behind you press their shields into your back to physically brace you. It is a massive, claustrophobic, locked organism of wood, leather, and iron.
You can barely see. You can barely breathe in there.
But as long as that wall stays locked together, it is basically impervious to a frontal assault. And behind that wall of shields are the housecarls with those Dane axes, just waiting to chop the legs off anything that gets close.
Now, at the bottom of the hill is the future. William's Norman army represents the absolute cutting edge of continental combined arms.
Right, he has three distinct elements.
He has a front line of archers and crossbowmen.
Yeah.
Behind them, he has his heavily armored infantry. And behind them, the ultimate weapon of the medieval world, the heavy cavalry.
We have to talk about how a Norman knight actually fights, because it's a massive technological leap from the Viking era. They are using a specific type of cantled saddle that literally locks the rider in, and they are using stirrups.
Right. This means the knight doesn't just stab downward with his spear like ancient cavalry did. He tucks his lance tightly under his arm. The couched lance technique.
Exactly. The stirrups and the saddle allow the knight to transfer the entire kinetic energy of a galloping 1,500-pound horse directly into the tip of that lance.
It hits with the force of a car crash. It can punch straight through an oak shield and the man holding it.
But William's technological advantage has a geographical problem. Harold holds the high ground. The battle begins around 9 a.m., and it just becomes an absolute meat grinder.
William sends his archers forward first. But firing uphill means the arrows lose their kinetic energy. They just bounce harmlessly off the English shields.
So then William sends his infantry up the hill. But trudging up that steep grade exhausts them. And when they finally hit the shield wall, they are brutally repulsed by the English axes and spears.
So William deploys the heavy cavalry. The ground shakes. Hundreds of knights charge up the slope.
But again, the physics of the hill rob the horses of their momentum. By the time they reach the top, they are at a trot, not a gallop. And the English housecarls just step out from the shield wall far enough to swing those massive axes.
The chroniclers describe horses having their heads cleaved completely off, knights being chopped in half straight through their chainmail. The cavalry is thrown back in bloody chaos.
For hours, the battle rages exactly like this. In the medieval world, battles usually end within an hour or two when one side breaks and runs, but Hastings lasts the entire day.
The English absorb charge after charge. It is an incredible display of discipline. All the English have to do to win is stand perfectly still. If they hold that hill until nightfall, William has to retreat to his ships without food, and the invasion fails.
The tension is just unbearable. There is a moment where the Norman left flank is getting butchered, and a rumor ripples through the army that Duke William has been killed.
Panic sets in immediately. The Normans actually start to break and run.
William has to push his helmet back, exposing his face, and gallops screaming across his own front lines, yelling, "Look at me! I am alive, and by God's help I will conquer," just to stop a full-scale rout.
The English shield wall is battered, but it is holding. William realizes that frontal assaults will not break it. He needs to physically dismantle the wall.
And this leads to the most controversial, brilliant, and devastating tactical maneuver of the battle, the feigned retreat.
Now, whether this was a spontaneous moment of panic that William weaponized or a pre-planned strategy, the result is exactly the same. A section of the Norman cavalry charges the hill, engages the shield wall, and then suddenly turns their horses and flees back down the slope.
Imagine the psychology of the English militiamen in that moment.
Yeah.
You have been standing in an armored crush for 6 hours, you are exhausted, you are terrified, you are watching your friends die, and suddenly the wealthy, arrogant French knights who have been tormenting you all day are running away in terror.
The temptation to break ranks and chase them down to kill them in the mud is just overwhelming.
The discipline cracks. Sections of the English line break the shield wall. They step forward, abandoning the high ground, abandoning their interlocking defense, and they run down the hill to chase the cavalry.
And the moment they are spread out on flat ground without the protection of the shield wall, William springs the trap. The fleeing Norman cavalry wheels their horses around.
Heavy cavalry against dispersed infantry on flat ground is not a battle. It is an absolute slaughter. The knights ride them down, lancing them and trampling them.
William sees that this works and he repeats it. Over and over, he orders his men to feign a retreat. And over, sections of the English army fall for it.
Slowly, painfully, the magnificent shield wall begins to thin out. It becomes porous. The overlapping shields no longer overlap.
As the afternoon wanes, William adjusts his combined arms strategy. Because the shield wall is thinning, he orders his archers to change their angle. Instead of firing straight at the shields, he tells them to fire at a high trajectory, almost straight up into the air.
The arrows rain down vertically. The English are forced to lift their shields above their heads to protect their faces, but the moment they lift their shields, they expose their torsos and legs to the Norman infantry and the charging cavalry. The whole system just falls apart.
And in this chaotic, bloody climax, the final fatal blow falls. King Harald Godwinson is killed.
Now, the most famous depiction of this comes from the Bayeux Tapestry, the 70-meter-long embroidered propaganda piece the Normans created after fact. It famously shows a figure labeled Harold the King gripping an arrow that has pierced his eye.
But we have to look at the reality behind the propaganda here.
Right, because the arrow in the eye is a powerful symbol. It's likely meant to imply divine judgment, the blinding of the oathbreaker.
Exactly. But other, much more grisly contemporary accounts suggest that while he may have been wounded by an arrow, a squad of Norman knights actually broke through the line, found the king fighting under his personal banner, pulled him to the ground, and literally hacked him to pieces.
The mutilation was so severe that the next day they had to use his mistress Edith Swanesha to identify his body by quote-unquote secret marks known only to her.
With the king dead and his brothers dead beside him, the English chain of command simply evaporates. The loyal housecarls form a final doomed ring around Harold's mangled body and fight to the last man upholding their ancient oaths.
But the rest of the army breaks and flees into the darkening woods. The battle is over. William the Bastard has become William the Conqueror.
But the battle is just the mechanism. We have to look at the aftermath, because the consequences of October 14th fundamentally rewire the entire world.
On Christmas Day, 1066, William is crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the exact same building where Edward the Confessor had died just 12 months earlier.
And William doesn't just change the management. He liquidates the entire Anglo-Saxon power structure.
He engages in a campaign of suppression so brutal, particularly in the north, an event known as the Harrying of the North, that he intentionally causes a famine that starves up to 100,000 people.
It's essentially a genocide. He takes the vast wealth and lands of the English earls and parcels it out to the roughly 200 Norman barons who fought for him at Hastings.
Within a single generation, the native English ruling class is entirely erased. You have a country where 95% of the population is Anglo-Saxon, but 100% of the land, the power, and the castles are controlled by a French-speaking Norman elite.
They begin building, but the Norman lord, sitting in the Great Hall, having that animal served to him, uses the French word: beef from boeuf, pork from pork, mutton from mouton, veal from veau.
The vocabulary of everyday life, water, house, friend, earth, remains Anglo-Saxon, but the vocabulary of authority, justice, court, sovereignty, military, prison, tax becomes completely French.
The Norman conquest forcibly welded a Romance language onto a Germanic foundation, giving English its incredible and honestly frustratingly massive vocabulary.
Geopolitically, the shift is just as massive. For the preceding 3 centuries, England had faced north. Its trade, its culture, its political marriages, and its existential threats all came from Scandinavia and the North Sea.
1066 takes England by the scruff of the neck, violently tears it away from the Viking world, and permanently locks it into the politics, the culture, and the endless wars of continental Europe and France.
But wait, this brings us to the most incredible irony of this entire deep dive. Let's look at William's DNA for a second. William is the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo. His army is full of men whose recent ancestors were Norsemen. The Normans are literally Northmen.
Right. So did the Vikings actually lose in 1066, or did they just beat themselves wearing a different uniform?
That is the genius of history's grand convergence. The Viking Age doesn't end by being defeated, it ends by evolving.
Break that down for me. Look at the 2 battles.
Okay, so at Stamford Bridge you have Harald Hardrada. He represents the old Viking paradigm. The Sea King, the raider, the man stepping straight out of a saga who relies on brute force and a wall of interlocking shields. When he dies with an arrow in his throat, the old Viking Age dies with him. That way of war is totally obsolete.
But at Hastings,
the new iteration of the Viking wins. The descendants of the Norsemen who settled in France didn't lose their brutal, restless martial energy. They simply upgraded it.
they traded the shallow draft longship for the heavy war horse.
They traded the chaotic, opportunistic raid for systematic, state-backed conquest. They adopted Christianity, they mastered continental logistics, and they built castles. The raiders became conquerors, and the conquerors became kings. The Norse DNA, that explosive expansionist drive that erupted out of Scandinavia back in 793, it didn't vanish. It was injected directly into the veins of the modern world. It forged the Duchy of Normandy, it built the foundation of the Russian state with the Rus, it settled the Commonwealth of Iceland.
And through the blood-soaked mud of Hastings, it permanently reorganized the English language, English common law, and the entire trajectory of the British Empire.
The old era had to be destroyed at Stamford Bridge so the new era could take dominion at Hastings. The men who butchered each other across the length of England in 1066 were branches of the exact same Norse tree. They finally collided, and when the dust settled, the world was fundamentally remade.
As we wrap up this culminating deep dive, I want you to really feel the sheer weight of what we've unpacked today. 3 kings, 2 unimaginable forced marches, a massacre at a bridge, a meat grinder on a hill.
The death of the Anglo-Saxon world and the climax of the Viking Age all packed into a handful of weeks.
And yet, what I find most profoundly haunting about 1066 is the terrifying fragility of it all. We like to think that history is driven by massive, unstoppable sociological forces. But think about the wind.
The breeze in the channel.
If a single localized weather pattern over the English Channel had shifted to blow from the south just 2 weeks earlier, William would have launched his fleet while Harald Godwinson was sitting on the southern coast with a fully supplied, fresh, and entrenched army.
The Norman cavalry trying to wade ashore through the surf against a rested English shield wall would have been totally slaughtered.
Harald Godwinson would have remained king. When Harald Hardrada eventually landed in the north, he would have faced a victorious, unbroken English king who hadn't just marched 500 miles.
The Norman conquest never happens. The English nobility survives. The English language never absorbs French. The laws and power structures that eventually govern massive portions of the globe never come into existence.
You and I and everyone listening are living in the direct aftermath of a localized breeze that blew across the water in September 1066. The world wasn't shaped by an inevitable glacier. It was shaped by the weather, a few desperate men, and an avalanche of violence.
That is an incredible place to leave it. And that brings us to the close of Season 3. We have traveled from the shocking terror of Lindisfarne all the way to the arrow storm at Hastings. But the story of the Norsemen isn't quite over. Next time, we invite you to join us for the premiere of our 4th and final season, Expansion and Legacy.
We're going to step away from the battlefields, the massacres, and the kings. We want to show you the reality of how these people actually lived.
We are going to walk the muddy, astonishingly preserved streets of a real Viking city dug straight out of the earth, Jorvik, the Viking heart of York. We will look at their homes, their coins, their daily lives, and answer the ultimate question: who truly won the Viking Age? Make sure to follow the show so you don't miss it. Until then, the next time you think the world is stable, just picture a square sail catching a sudden gust of wind and an avalanche of history waiting to fall.